So I'm very honored to have E.M. Nicolay here. He said to say he goes by Gene. He's E.M. Nicolay, but his friends call him Gene, so you can call him Gene. A gifted, internationally known remote viewer, intuitive, medical intuitive, workshop leader, and professional coach who has dedicated himself to assisting individuals, organizations, and businesses access higher guidance through a better understanding of their soul's journey, which he describes as the essence path. And that is what he's going to describe to us tonight. So please welcome E.M. Nicolay.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Judy. Thank you for that beautiful meditation and for that introduction. And thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. I'm here with my co-author, Lee, and we're going to do something a little bit different tonight. We have a lot of ground to cover, and rather than do a lecture where we're just giving you information, Lee is going to, in effect, kind of ask me questions about the book, and then we're going to have a conversation, and we're going to let you, in a certain sense, eavesdrop on our conversation. And then we'll save plenty of time for questions and answer at the end, so hopefully then you can really participate, and we can do that.
Yeah, we joke about this as the Oprah style. So today you are invited to hear the conversation between us. Oprah has been very popular, so perhaps we have something to learn from them. Anyway, as Judy has introduced you, Jean, we know that you are an intuitive remote viewer. You have many talents. Could you just give the audience a little background on how your talents came about and how you developed it?
I think to a certain extent everyone has a talent for having intuitive abilities. Some of us are a little bit more gifted, sometimes because of practice, but sometimes it actually is a little bit genetic. I know with myself, my mother and my grandmother both were extremely psychic and trance mediums. My sister is so incredibly in tune that since the age of 10, she has to sleep with the television on very loud so she can drown out the voices that are talking to her. I've always had that talent, and I've actually since discovered that there is a actual phenomenon that takes place with the pituitary gland, and it's the pituitary gland linked with the pineal gland that actually does give you a little bit extra, perhaps, push in that particular, having those particular talents. So I always had those talents, and I was the kid. And by the way, I have actually had the pituitary gland measured and had scans done. There's nothing wrong with it; it's perfectly fine. But it actually, according to the doctors who scratched their head, it's a deformed pituitary gland that somehow is signaling in a very strange way. Right. So I was the kid who, very, very young, would have the neighborhood kids come in, and we would literally be talking to some disembodied figure that would answer our questions by tapping once yes and twice for no and that type of thing. And of course, naturally, my parents, that was to be frowned upon. I'm sure everybody's gone through that. Kids are naturally intuitive, and it's kind of drummed out of them. And what essentially happened was, I was taught to ignore it and to put it aside. And even though it would emerge constantly, especially when I went through puberty and, at the age of, 14, 15, 16, it was really pushed aside and submerged. I went on to finish school to become a very corporate person. I worked in the corporate world for a long time doing marketing and marketing communications, working for a lot of international companies. And at the age, who was for a friend of mine who was a very well-known therapist in New York City, and she was a Jungian therapist, and she did a lot of work with hypnosis. And she needed a brochure. And I said, yeah, okay, no problem. I'll help your friend out, and I'll, I'm being told that I have to do something for you. Please, come and let me do something for you. So I guess about 3 or 4 weeks into it, I had a very, very important meeting, pitching some advertising ideas for Henry Bendel's in New York. I don't know if anyone knows it. And it was with the president and with the head of the company and head of various suggestions to just help me really nail this presentation because it's very important to me. So she said, great. And I went over, and she sort of started to relax me. And again, you have to understand, I had always known that something was there. I had always been into things that other people weren't into. She relaxed me, and within, I'd say, 60, had it all on tape. And it turned out, after then, of course, she wanted me to come back the next day, and I was intrigued, and I went back, and still being very, very corporate about it, and it's like, oh yeah, what's this? And it turned out that I had a pre-arrangement with her, a contract prior to the lifetime, that she would open me to being called to do, that I would help people in ways that I could not even imagine. And we continued to work together, and as we started working together, suddenly things started changing dramatically for me. Synchronicity started happening, all kinds of synchronicities. I started to notice that I could actually see colors around people. I could see auras. A woman would be there, and you have to tell my husband I'm okay. And I would say to the cab driver, did you just lose your wife? Yes, I did. Why? Well, she's kind of here telling me she's okay.
I want to tell you something.
And this evolved very, very quickly to the point where she then started to call me, and like I said, she was a Jungian therapist, with a lot. I said, okay, well, let's tune in, and we'll take a look at it for you. And I was able to decipher by accessing what became known to me as the Akashic records of this person, exactly what was happening with them, exactly why they were having the issues that they were having. And this is incredible, because she was so connected with a number of Jungian therapists on the East Coast, suddenly I was getting calls from all kinds of therapists. And they all wanted a consultation because they had a particularly difficult case. And I did that, and then just word of mouth, people started calling me from all over the world. And I started to discern that there were certain archetypal relations to them, exactly what was happening. And this just turned into sort of snowballed into kind of an incredible thing, where all of a sudden then I was getting calls, healers, priests, and then one day I got a mysterious call. And a lot of time happened in between, and at this particular point I was really still very much in the corporate world, but sort of now at this point switching over, because I couldn't do that anymore. This wasn't serious. And what ultimately happened was I was taken by a group of people, one of whom I did know, and which is the reason for the connection. And I was introduced to people in the Macau government. And I was taken in to talk, this was Macau, wanted to have a consultation with me about what was going to happen when the handover occurred. And after we were done talking about all of that and what I remote viewed was going to actually transpire, which ultimately did, then they all wanted to hear about themselves, and that includes the ambassador. So that went very well, and I thought nothing of it. I was really just kind of trying to help people to understand what was happening to them. And I got back to this country, and I got another mysterious phone call. And this phone call was, we have a job for you, and we'd like for you to come and meet us. And it was a gentleman with a very strange name and a very sort of very stern kind of voice. And I'm in Philadelphia, and he was outside of Philadelphia. Gee, I just don't understand what the heck this is. It's like this is supposed to be a big corporate job. And I ring the bell, and a woman answers the phone, or answers the door, and there's no furniture in this house. And they take me to the back of the house, and they take me into a room, and all of a sudden there's this enormous office, and there's a gentleman who comes in, and he introduces himself, and he's dressed in civilian clothing, but I'm looking around the office, and I'm seeing pictures of this guy with President Ford, and with President Reagan, and with all the people in government, from the 70s, 80s, early 90s. And he says, I think we can use you, and we talk for a while, but he's not, totally, we're interviewing you for a corporate job. Okay. But we'd like to know this stuff that you do, that we've heard about, what's it all about? And I'm trying to, he sends me to a company where, within 5 minutes, it's like, okay, yes, we need for you to join us, and you're going to be in charge of XYZ International Division. And, okay, this is, and any amount of money that you want. It's okay, doesn't matter. And on top of it, it's this big corporate complex in the middle of a cornfield, in the middle of the country in Pennsylvania, to a friend. And I say, there's this company and it's called this, and they want me to work for them, and it's like very strange. And the next day, I'm receiving a telephone call from someone who works for the Boston Globe newspaper in Boston, and she says, I'm doing an expose, and I'm doing an article, and I heard about you through our friend. Do you know that company is a front for the CIA? And I said, I know nothing at all about that, absolutely nothing, goodbye. And she tried several times to talk to me and wanted to, start telling me, well, these companies, what's happened is, they don't do anything now, out in the open, and they've created a bunch of shell companies or companies that pretend to do something, that pretend to sell something, and then they hire people like you, and they never really tell you what's going on because, it's a need-to-know basis. But probably that's what this is all about. I said, no. They want me to do their international marketing. Well, long story short, they didn't want me to do their international marketing. And I actually got reprimanded for doing. They did want events, meeting various people in different organizations. They would come in, the CEO would walk into this company and would say things like, would you write a report about what you think is going to happen in South Africa? And, well, I haven't been to South Africa. Well, it doesn't matter. Just write a report. About what? That the way that they were operating was that, very, clandestinely write something and write a report, and then you'd come back, and then they'd come back and say, oh, you mentioned something here about how this person is going to do this, and this group of off-world people is doing this, and could you elaborate on that? Okay, yeah. But two things happened. The first was that, like I said, they would send me all over the world, and they sent me to a place where I was supposed to meet someone, and it was in not the south of France, but over in southwestern France. And again, just like they were in a cornfield, this was out in like nowhere, where suddenly you're driving on this. And I said, well, this is the place, and I was by myself, and I knocked on the door, and a guy came to the door, and he thought I was someone else. And he essentially, I just went with it, he essentially spilled the beans. And that made me very, very nervous. He showed me around the operations. The operations were a bunch of people sitting in front of computers, monitoring the world. And this was supposed to be a sales office of this company, something for the company that I was working for. And you weren't allowed in there. You had to have special access. And somehow, accidentally, I got access into the building. There was a room the size of this that had a couple of offices in it, and then a door. And someone walked out, and I was able to step in, and there were just banks and banks and banks and banks of, again, computers and people doing things that had nothing to do with this company. It made me nervous, and it kind of upset me, and at that particular point, at the same time, I was still working with a lot of therapists and a lot of people calling from all over the world, sort of, on the side. And I decided that, it was time for me to move on, because the most telling thing that happened was the fact that this was a high-tech company, and one of their control, I thought about it, and I said, this is not the direction that I want to go in. I had a lot of trouble leaving. It was not easy. I was fortunate in that I wasn't there a long time, need-to-know basis. They didn't know what I knew. Everything could be of a company, in cities that were hundreds of miles away, a block away, just standing at a light post staring at me. And this happened, it really took me, a good 10 years before that kind of thing stopped. And I can't say that it has stopped even yet, because I still get calls from neighbors who will say things to me like, there was a man in a black suit looking through your garbage at 4 in the morning, and we don't understand because all of our garbages were out, but he only looked at yours. I have no idea, but needless to say, I don't throw anything out of my garbage. So that actually then led to working more and more with real people, and with people helping them to discover what their life path is all about. What essentially became known, I was talking before, when you look at different people's Akashic records, there are very, very telling things that are archetypal. And even though everyone is unique, a certain energetic expression that was related to your soul, that you carried with you, it was almost like a vibrational signature from lifetime to lifetime. I would see that for a particular lifetime, there was definitely a life mission that you had planned. And then I would see that there was particular personality traits that you had chosen prior to the lifetime that would be formulated in. And this is the reason why you would choose the parents that you chose, the environment that you chose, would create these personality traits that would serve almost as your glasses that you would then see the world through. And this then would actually affect the way in which energy would be attracted to you. And I would see that your vibrational state, one of the most important things is that, the third dimension, and this, our solar system and our universe in the third dimension is based on polarity. And things are negative or positive. And now that's not good or bad or right or wrong. It's just that it generates really essentially the universe and attracts, it creates an electromagnetic scalar waves that actually then attracts what happens to you in your reality. And I would see that if you were in the negative polarity of your personality trait, you would then vibrate at a certain resonance that would attract life, your life mission, from a negative pole. And when it did, how to then change that, and change that vibrational energy by analyzing your personality attribute and switch it into the positive pole. That would affect your vibrational resonance, and that would then go out into the world, and since like attracts like, you'd be able to attract your mission from the positive polarity. And we're going to talk a lot about this tomorrow in our in our workshop, yep. Because we actually have, I'm going to go through all of the attributes, and we've been going to try and or themselves and kind of do it that way. But to make a long story short, I actually then figured out from that the positive polarity could be associated with what I'm calling your essence path, because your soul wants you to be happy. Your soul wants you to have joy in your life. But your soul doesn't care how you find growth, as long as you find the growth that you set out to have in this lifetime. And it doesn't care if you learn about love by having very hateful experiences, but obviously, isn't it going to be nicer to have experiences of love to learn the lesson of love? And figuring that out is making you, then putting you on your essence path, so that you are getting guidance from your soul directly, as opposed to being in what I call your ego. Because when you're in your ego, that's when you're in the negative polarity of your personality feature, and then that affects your vibrational energy, which goes out into the world and attracts the negative of your life mission. That created for us the concept of discovering your essence path, because if you can discover your essence path, you can essentially discover your soul's true intent. And if you can discover your soul's true intent, you can push life into the positive, as opposed to being constantly attracting negative situations that are very, very challenging. And that's really essentially what I've been trying to do with people all along. It goes further. And naturally, there's more complexity to it. I'm really putting it into a nutshell for you. But groups and organizations like this one have a mission and an energetic expression and attributes that affect the outcome. And people join with those groups for specific reasons related to their soul growth, and sometimes related to how it interfaces with their own mission and with their own energetic expression. So that's essentially what we're trying to do. Yep. The next step to that, though, was to begin writing the series of books, which is what we've done. And the books, the first and second book, are really the very, very basics about discovering your essence path. The third book is called The System Lords and the 12 Dimensions. That is essentially a look at how the universe is actually structured and sort of what this thing Ascension is all about. It was written around the 2012 period because there were so many people walking around like, the world is coming to an end. And, it really was written to say, no, it's not coming to an end. But here's what's really happening. And then from that, because there was so much conflict happening, and because the world just seemed to be kind of spiraling out of control, we were prompted to write the fourth book, which is what we're discussing tonight, although we've discussed everything else. But
we will be discussing.
But it's called Timeline, Collapse, and Universal Ascension. And it is a look not only at the concept of ascension, which is another thing like 2012, where people just, the aliens are going to beam us up. And, I'm sorry, and, I appreciate it. It's okay if people believe that, but it's just not going to happen.
Before you do that, could you explain what do you mean by timeline collapse? Because not everybody here has read the book, and I think just the terms itself suggests something catastrophic. Okay. So, let's have that defined, as well as universal ascension.
Absolutely. The fourth book talks about two different timelines. And it talks about the timeline of the third dimension, and it also talks about the second part of the book, about the timeline of fifth dimensional Earth, which is called Terra. What is currently happening in this period of ascension is that ascension is essentially the universal evolutionary process. In that process, beings, universes, solar systems, galaxies raise their vibrational energy so that they oscillate at a point where they flatline and then evolve and turn into the next universal dimension. So what happens here is the third dimension, which we currently live in, what I call third universal dimension that we currently live in, is in the process of ascension. But as this happens, and it is a little bit complex, so try and bear with me. As it happens, the second dimension is evolving, the first dimension is evolving, and the second dimension evolves into the third dimension, and the third dimension evolves into the fourth and fifth dimension, and the timeline, which essentially a dimension is basically a time wave, and the timeline of the one that we've been on collapses and folds into the next higher timeline. Now, what's interesting about this is that it's happening with the planet, and it's happening with our solar system and the universe, but it's also happening with us. And not everyone wants to evolve into the fourth and fifth dimension. And that's because they're actually younger baby souls who have not had much of the experience that people of higher consciousness have, and they are going to be staying on a third dimensional timeline. Meanwhile, people who have evolved and are ready to cycle off in their incarnation are ready now, because of their own frequency and their own oscillation, to, during the next incarnations, raise their incarnations and incarnate in a fifth dimensional Earth, which we call Terra. Now, as this happens, there's a time. It's not magic. It's really a mechanical process, and so we don't just all go together. Everyone, since everyone is unique, goes at their own speed. But there is then a time period, because this ascension process is happening, it started happening in about 1900, it's really going to continue to about 2250. As it happens, people are going to be living side by side. And essentially that means that those of a higher consciousness who have not yet cycled off their incarnations in the third dimension are going to be living alongside more and more those who are going to be continuing on in a third dimensional existence. The third dimensional existence, especially for younger souls, and I'm sure you've heard this before, but younger souls, baby souls, those who have not had as many incarnations or lifetimes, they essentially see the world as me and other me's. I want everyone to be just like me because I'm a child. Older souls are, you're you, I'm me, do what you want, I'm going to do what I want, with harm to no one. Well, obviously those things don't go together. But we're here in a period of, 100, 200, 250 years where essentially until we've actually cycled off, we're living side by side with more and more young souls who are evolving from the second dimension or who are incarnating, who are going to be staying in third dimensional reality, and we have to live alongside them. That prompted the book because we wanted to take a look, by way of remote viewing, of what actually is on that timeline. Now, the timeline is very interesting because, like I said, time is essentially, a wave of motion that's related to the dimension. It actually is the dimension. And from the way we see time is that it's a spiral. And there are different points on the timeline. Time is not linear the way we think of it. It's happening in a spiral. Something that happened in the 15th century could essentially, on this spiral, be very, very close or related to something that's happening, in the 19th century or the 20th century, because of the way it's a spiral and because it's not linear. And I guess souls plan their lifetimes, nothing linear, you can go back and forth and what have you. But the one thing that's happening is that timeline is beginning to deteriorate and collapse, will turn into a continuation of the third dimensional timeline, but it won't be the timeline that it was, because that third dimensional timeline that we were on, where everything made sense, is actually then evolving to the next level. So in the book, we wanted to actually put together, okay, let's take a look at what's coming up on this third dimensional timeline. And that's where you see some pretty heady stuff. I mean, it's not a pretty time, unfortunately. The good news is that actually the good news is two things. First of all, that we will start to, as we cycle off, incarnate at a higher dimensional level so that we won't be a part of it. It's not like we're coming back. Same with our loved ones, same with our kids.
Yes. Sure.
Yeah. And so that actually helps.
Right. Definitely helps too.
I forgot where I was going with that, but we'll catch up.
Yeah, I think what's happening now, as Judy and you and I were talking, right after the election, we thought we were living in one country. Now we find ourselves perhaps not in the same country that we thought we were in. Yep. So is that part of what you were talking about? That
It is, because actually what you're seeing is very much indicative of the idea that younger souls who are very much akin to, I want to force everyone to be just like me, which is kind of a fundamentalist mentality.
Yes.
No matter what side you're on,
right.
These souls are more and more proliferating, and older souls are beginning to cycle off. And we just weren't really aware of it. What's interesting when you look at the timeline and you see what happens, especially in the United States, which is where, I guess that's our concern, because that's where we live. You see that like attracts like. Because younger souls are so interested in karma, which essentially is about, when I talk about karma, I mean karma can be exterior karma where it's, involved with other people and the mass consciousness and the world and the environment. So every time there's a war and every time there's something that raises havoc, that's an opportunity for growth for a younger soul who's invested in having that kind of karma. Whereas an older soul is really more interested in self-karma. I want to really develop myself. I want to really grow myself. I don't need to have this eye for an eye kind of stuff happening, and I don't need to be around that. So what you see happening on the timeline that's interesting is that like people will start to attract each other and will start to band together. And so organizations like this will grow and will attract like-minded people. And then when you take that further, you take it to the fact that maybe, possibly, and it does show up in the timeline, the various strong states where higher consciousness people live will not really have a need to be sort of with those baby souls anymore. And what you see happen on the timeline is, in the United States specifically, to be really specific, is you see it breaking up, and you see things happen like the creation of the Pacific Coast region. And you see that region come together almost as a country in and of itself, because like-minded people are going to want to live in that pocket. There's also a pocket like that is in New England. There's a pocket like that is, believe it or not, in southern Florida for as long as southern Florida is there. There's the state of Texas. Now, they're not all, people who resonate at, the same levels, but then you see sort of a union in Texas emerge. And what we're talking about now is we're talking about pretty much, while the federal government is still kind of there, if you look on the timeline, you see more and more that it's becoming bankrupt, it's becoming corrupt, it's losing its power, and you see this happening now. They're giving back the power to the states. Essentially, they want to orchestrate this kind of a breakup. And you kind of can tell that this is really the direction that everything is going. Now, the interesting thing is that simultaneous to all of this, and what really becomes fascinating is World War III actually already started. It's not being called World War III, it hasn't been called World War III, but everything you have seen happening in the Middle East is actually essentially World War III. Everything that you see happening with ISIS, which is totally fabricated, and was actually, according to our information, fabricated by certain deep pockets in the government for specific reasons that you can read about, that becomes more and more problematic. And what is going to happen is that conflict will continue, and it will absolutely wreak havoc in the Middle East and could actually turn nuclear. When that happens, there is ultimately a problem in Europe, and Europe will see some pretty great devastation. From our standpoint here in America, it essentially heralds the bankruptcy of the federal government. Once the federal government does become bankrupt, it's at that point, even though it might still be in existence, it has given back everything to the states, and it's at that point that various states that where there are higher consciousness people will band together and will start to create their own monetary systems, their own militias, their own whatever they need to survive. And I think you essentially see that happening. I mean, and now, the book we wrote the book several years ago, but you see it coming to fruition now. And eventually, according to the book, the federal government does just sort of fall apart, and it falls apart at the point that, there are some terrorist incidents that happen, and then that really essentially seals the fate of the federal government. Now, we're talking further in advance. We're not talking tomorrow, but we're talking about this evolving in time over the course of the coming 50 years. But with a great deal of it happening between now and 2030, which will affect many of us. That then leads to the Second American Civil War. But the interesting thing here, you guys, I hope you all live in California because you're in a good place. Because the Second U.S. Civil War takes place in all of the states that do not band together and who continue to be sort of, independent and in alignment with what is happening with many of the younger souls. Now, you have to remember, this is not to make anybody afraid. This is not to be fearful. It is really to help us understand what's happening so that we're called to the right place and so that we know what's going on. And again, I have to say, if this does transpire, if there is a breakup of the United States, you will be called to the place where you are supposed to be. And if you are of a higher resonance and a higher consciousness, you will be in a place where it does not affect you as directly as if you are a younger soul or as if you are sort of going to remain in third dimensional incarnations. Because remember that it sounds odd to say, but a younger soul really kind of is here for maximum growth in terms of karma with regard to the mass consciousness environment. So when there's a civil war, they're there. When there's problems, they're there. And, naturally it's not pleasant, but it does afford them opportunities for growth. And one thing that I have seen working with, just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, is that you will go out of your way, unconsciously and from a soul basis, to find growth. And everything, potentially, is an opportunity for growth. So what we tried to do in the book, and again, this is not to cause any kind of fear, was to show more or less what we're envisioning and what we saw when we took a look, very in-depth look, at the timeline and exactly how it would transpire. The second part of the book, though, which is kind of fascinating to me, is the part that talks about what life will be like for those of us who actually do ascend in the fifth dimension. And everything you've ever heard about sort of the golden era, the golden age of man, and the coming, that's going on. Essentially, those are glimpses. That's not third dimensional in nature. Those are glimpses into where we will be going in terms of the fifth dimension. And we try and sort of invite that. And we end the discussion with what we can look forward to, and on a very, I think, positive note. The thing to remember is, no matter what happens, life goes on. And, we do become fearful of these things, but fear is the killer. Fear dulls your resonance and your vibrational energy. And you'll notice that a lot of lower consciousness people the first thing that they'll try and do is make you afraid of something. And that is part of why we did the book. It's like, this is what's going to happen, but don't be afraid. There's no reason to fear it. It's happening for a reason, and it's related to these younger souls, the ascension process, the evolutionary process that we're all going through, and we're going to be in the right place, and it'll be okay. So that's essentially, that gives you, in a nutshell.
For one, I'm glad to hear that. So,
we all are.
Yes. Let's switch gear a little bit.
By the way, I'm looking for property in California. So. Go ahead.
I know there's an interest in the topic of aliens intervention in this world, third dimensional world that we live in. Yeah. Could you touch on that? Just highlights. I know that there's a whole chapter in the third book, The System Lords, but if we just give our audience a little bit of what it's about.
There has been alien intervention that we look at on the timeline since, as far back as we've looked is 260,000 years, and it continues today. There was a short period of time where higher dimensional beings did not allow interference, and I believe it was between roughly like the 15th century and somewhere in the neighborhood of the 16th or 17th century, where there was no interference. But aside from that, there has been interference. Now, the Earth realm, and actually in all the dimensions, because they're all superimposed on each other. So Terra, the fifth dimension, is superimposed on Earth, its third dimension, and Gaia, seventh dimensional Earth, superimposed again. All of those, this sector of the galaxy, this sector of the solar system, this solar system in particular, is designated for human angelic souls. They are the guardians, and the human angelic souls who incarnate, for the most part, as human beings, have specific keys and codes in their DNA that really guard this sector of the universe. It also guards the energetic portals that are, the portals of energy that allow interface with the other dimensions.
The aliens.
Yeah.
The human.
What I was going to say is that this whole entire galaxy and this whole sector in all the dimensions is a free will sector. It has been designated that from the start, which means that aliens cannot come in and just take over. But what aliens can do is influence those incarnates who are related to them to, in a certain sense, do their bidding. And then that somehow is permitted. The reason why that's important is because you have what I'm going to call extraterrestrial souls who are now able to incarnate in human physical bodies. Now, the thing is, they don't have, and I'm sorry if this sounds sci-fi to a lot of people, but this is what it is.
So when we think of aliens, they do not look like...
Well, we're not talking about aliens walking down the street
right.
with
big
little
heads,
antennas, or almond
little
eyes.
bodies. Right.
For the most part, you're talking about alien soul incarnations who are incarnated into human physical bodies.
So they look just like...
Yeah, they are. But what's key here is that, first of all, they do not have the DNA that are the human angelic codes that guard this sector, and they never can have that. It also means that they cannot ascend, so they are related to entities who really want to stay in the third dimension.
Right.
And more, they're proliferating right now because of a very strange, as if all the other stuff wasn't bad enough.
Or stranger.
There is a proliferation of them now that is really related to a problem that is happening in a certain sector related to the Zetas. The Zetas are very technologically advanced, and they actually experiment with time travel and how to fold the time spiral that we were talking about. In their galaxy, they have, because of doing something wrong, created a rip in their time continuum. That rip has become essentially a black hole in their galaxy, and they are being more and more sucked into this black hole, and essentially it will mean the demise of their galaxy. It also means the demise, if the souls that have incarnations in that particular world cannot retrieve the golden threads, then everything related to those incarnations is lost, and they just get sucked into the black hole. Because they're good at time travel, they have figured out that the timeline we were talking about, the closest place to them on the timeline is our period right now. So over the course of the last 100 years, they came back in time because they're 10,000 years ahead. They've come back in time thinking that if they could just use this world, Earth, for a little while, they might be able to figure out how to fix what's going on 10,000 years in the future. And they will actually then go back and they will fix the rip and everyone will be happy. In the meantime, though, they have come back, and very heavily, starting in World War II, they are the ones who have given all kinds of technology with regard to how to weaponize scalar energy, how to weaponize the weather, different things like that. And we have people in the deep government who are patting themselves on the back because they've gotten all this technology from the Zetas, but essentially the Zetas are giving them enough technology to be able to hang themselves and destroy the world so that they can actually incarnate on it, buying time to be able to fix what's going on in their galaxy. What this means, it's very important, because what it means is that we have alien souls who, alongside the baby souls of human angelics, are incarnating in human form, who essentially want to keep this as a third-dimensional vehicle for themselves. And the big problem is that I'm going to suggest that many of the people in positions of power, particularly some of the people who might seem to be kind of psychopathic, are actually not human angelic soul incarnations. They are actually incarnations with a different soul origin. And you have to remember that when you have a soul origin, because you have an expression and you're related to your oversoul, you're going to get guidance from that oversoul. And their guidance is going to be related to something that is not necessarily in our best interest. Now, in the book, when we look on the timeline, it suggests that if this continues, that Earth will actually come to our rescue. And that Earth itself will push a reset button through a cataclysmic occurrence that will take place, most probably something like an asteroid or something, and will allow that to happen in approximately, I think it's 2569 or 2560 is where we saw it, that then will reset time. Meaning that, it'll destroy most of life on Earth, and there will be a reset. There will be pockets of life that are still here, but then there will be a new seeding of human angelics. There's a possibility, we haven't looked that far, but there is a possibility based on what we saw, that at that particular point, Earth will allow a seeding that creates humans who are able to have both alien souls and human angelic souls incarnate in the physical body and still have the proper DNA to essentially have the coding for the portals, for the energetic portals that allow access to other dimensions. So the reason why aliens is important is not because they're going to come and pick us up or anything like that, but because of that particular scenario. Now, granted, we are definitely protected by other groups of extraterrestrials. Generally, they're higher dimensional. They are not third dimensional. They are fifth or sixth dimensional. A lot of people, the Pleiades and different, there are different, the Arcturians, who actually do act as guardians. And they were the ones who, when the Draconians from Draco, I don't know how to pronounce Draco, actually created their offspring, in a certain sense, of the dinosaurs, they're the ones who then reset and destroyed that particular culture, because it was a draconian initiative to actually take over this sector and to take over Earth. And that was not to be permitted. So when they were seeing how successful they were, that was actually stopped. And that was when I believe that was when the second seeding of man started. To at least understand that, there are some that are just, in their own form, visiting, but they're not all walking among us, but that it is possible that there are incarnations of people. They tend to be, I try not to say it, but they tend to be people who really have no empathy, who seem to really just sort of, they're all about power and dominance. They're all about authoritarianism, because that's sort of how they exist. So you kind of tell, most of them are CEOs. So, But anyway, that's just a joke. They're not all seeds. But anyway, so, and that's that. Okay?
So how best could we perhaps help against the alien efforts to keep the third dimensional world from ascension? How best could people like this group?
Well, they cannot stop the ascension process. It's a universal process that will happen. And like I said, it's the universal evolutionary process. But it's why it becomes so important for us to start to become aware. It's why it's important for us to raise our vibrational energy. It's why we really do need to become heart-centered. Because there is a point at which the tipping point is reached, which will then drive the dimension into the next phase and into the higher dimension. And that tipping point can only be reached if we all suddenly start to be more aware of our consciousness, of our soul path, of our essence, of our connection to our higher self and to God, and raise that vibrational energy. Because you have to remember, and I know you know this, your vibrational energy, I mean, you know, it's exponential in terms of affecting other people. So we might just be us, but if one person raises their energy and goes out, there might be 5, 10, 100 other people who then are affected by that, and that can raise the tipping point, and that can actually help everyone, not only personally to ascend, but to help the entire dimension and the planet to ascend. And that really is the greatest defense. Now, they won't be successful because we looked on the timeline, and that's why there is a reset planned if they really do, if that really does happen. Unfortunately, it does appear to happen because there is a reset plan, and it's there. But they can't stop. They can't stop us from ascending. They can't stop the dimension from ascending, even though they think that they can. And they will try, but it does not have to happen. And in any case, I think that if your own vibrational energy reaches a tipping point and is high enough, you will ultimately be ready to cycle off and to incarnate at a higher dimensional value and a higher dimensional density. Make sense?
Yep, that makes sense, and I think that's what makes groups like this so important.
Yep. Exactly. Good.
Okay, I think that covers what we would like to cover. We could take questions.
So why don't we do questions?
Okay.
And how does what you teach tomorrow, is it going to be 3 hours straight? Is that going to tie in with this, or what?
Well, no, right, tonight we're talking about, tonight was a discussion about the fourth book. Tomorrow's workshop is really about the methodology of discovering your own essence path. So tomorrow we're strictly going to talk about what are the archetypal energies of soul origins and where do they come from? What are they? What are the archetypal typical missions that I've seen that people actually, and missions are actually a really interesting thing because people sometimes think that, well, your mission is to be a doctor. Your mission is to be a lawyer. Absolutely nothing could be further from the truth. Missions tend to be very much related to learning about specific areas and specific things, and not at all about, well, you know, you should be a doctor and you should be a this and you should be a that. So we're going to talk about those archetypal energies, and we're going to talk about those archetypal missions that typically are found in the Akashic records. There tend to be, from what I've seen, 7 of them. There are times where people, particularly older souls, will maybe choose 2, or maybe choose 1 for the first half of the life and 1 for the second half of the life. Then we're going to talk about the archetypal attributes that people pick that are the reason why you choose your parents, the reason why you choose the environment that you grow up in. We're going to talk about polarity, and we're going to talk about how, you know, the difference between the positive and negative pole. And we're going to talk then about how how this all comes together. So how does the attribute interface with the mission to allow you to express your energetic soul energy. And what happens when this is in the negative polarity? Here's the direction it goes. What happens when you push it into the positive polarity, and how do you push it into the positive polarity? And here is how this interfaces with your mission, and here's how that goes. So then I think what we plan on doing is, we've created the chart, and we're all going to kind of, okay, now if you want to do it for yourself, if you want to do it for friends, let's take a look at yourself. And we'll go through it step by step and see if maybe you can plug in the archetypal energy to yourself.